Good evening. Prime Ministers, ambassadors, members of the Parliament, distinguished guests. On behalf of the Board of Directors of the Harvard Business School Club of Greece, I would like to thank you all for joining us here tonight. Our club's tradition is to invite world-renowned speakers to discuss crucial economic, political, and social issues. The outcome of the German elections is of importance, not only for Germany, but also for Europe, as it defines how Germany will influence the future design of the European Union. Tonight's discussion will attempt to shed light on three issues. First, the result of the German elections and the main drivers for this outcome. Second, the impact of the German elections on the architecture of the Eurozone, the reforms of the European Union, and the future Franco-German cooperation, specifically the European budget, the European Monetary Fund, the European Finance Minister, and the Banking Union. Third, we will address how the German elections might influence Greece and its economic recovery, the debt reduction, the quantitative easing, the non-performing loans, the surplus. We are honored that the following distinguished speakers accepted our invitation to share with us their valuable insights on these extremely topical issues. Kyriakos Mitsotakis, President of New Democracy and member of the Harvard Business School Club. His Excellency Jens Plötner-Ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany. Dr. Lorenzo Bini Smaghi, Chairman of Société Générale and former ECB Executive Director. Dr. Daniel Gros, Director of the Center for European Policy Studies. We would also like to thank the ambassadors that honor us here tonight with their presence, and we look forward to also hearing their views on these matters. In closing, we would like to thank the National Bank of Greece, and in particular the President Thomopoulos and the CEO Kyriakos, who are with us tonight, for their gracious hospitality. And finally, we would like to thank the founder and owner of RACAP, also a distinguished member of the Harvard Business School Club, for his sponsorship of the event. Thank you. We would like to start with the results of the German elections. We have with us distinguished Ambassador Jens Plötner. My first three questions for you, Ambassador, are the following. Why did the main parties lose their electoral power? Who is actually the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, and why did it grow so much? Why did the socialists rule out the new Grand Coalition?
So I have 2 hours now, and then we go on to the other questions?
Usually the maximum is 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. But Stelios, those were 5 questions, so 5 times 5. We're in the central bank, so we have to get the math right. No, first of all, thank you very much for your very kind invitation, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your interest in this evening's subject. Somehow I guessed that you would call on me first, so I have this not easy task to answer this whole bunch of questions. The first one you asked, why did the big parties CDU, CSU, and SPD, the Conservatives and the Social Democrats, why did they lose so much votes? The easy answer is, I think this has been a trend over the past decades, that you have a fragmentation of society. The traditional link between socio-economic milieus and political parties does not work anymore. And due to the fragmentation of society, you have a fragmentation of the political landscape as well. Today, we have a number of parties in Bundestag we have never seen before. And I think this corresponds to the way German society has evolved. The second question you asked me, why has AfD turned out so strong? I think it is important to understand the motives behind the vote for the AfD. Pollsters tell us, and I consider that to be a reliable information, pollsters tell us that more than 60% of the AfD voters voted for this party out of protest. And only the rest, so 35, voted because they knew what AfD wanted and they were in favor of that. So it's a vote of protest. And this motivation is also underpinned by the voter movement towards the AfD. All big parties lost voters to the AfD. CDU, CSU lost 1 million voters to the AfD. The SPD lost more than 500,000 voters to the AfD. Even FDP lost, they gained others, but they lost some to the AfD. So it shows you that from all corners of the political spectrum, people came to the AfD to protest against something. What exactly they are protesting against, that's a big discussion I think we should have, but maybe not in this first round. And then they managed to mobilize 1 million of previously non-voters. So it shows that people who were simply frustrated with the political system found that the AfD touched on issues, touched on a sentiment which they felt worth supporting. So I think it would be wrong in that absolute sense to say that the AfD voters are Nazis or extreme right. I think it would be fair to say that you find people who can be called this way in the leadership and in the mid-management of the AfD, but I think it would flaw our understanding of what is happening if we would characterize the voters in such a way. The voters come from all avenues of the political spectrum, and they have one thing which unites them: it's the protest against the last 4, 10, 8 years of German politics.
I would like to ask President Mitsotakis, what is the impact of the German elections, in your opinion, for the German democracy? Do you perceive a threat of growing populism? And what does this mean for the European course of Germany?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this extremely interesting debate. A few brief comments on the German election. First of all, we should not forget that Chancellor Merkel won a 4th term. This in itself is a big success, which to a certain extent is underestimated by the fact that the CSU and the CDU underperformed vis-à-vis the initial expectations and vis-à-vis their previous electoral results. One should also keep in mind that in a multi-party system, setting the bar extremely high when you have many parties competing and undermining traditional establishment parties is a very, very tall task to achieve. At the end of the day, the likely outcome of the German election is going to be a Jamaica coalition, what many people expected to happen before the election. If anything, some people expected just a two-party coalition. This is no longer possible, so Germany will be faced with the challenge of forming a three-party coalition, something which, if I'm not mistaken, has not happened in German history, and which will make obviously the discussions that much more complicated. The AfD won 6 million votes, and Die Linke won probably 4.5, 5 million votes, so 11 million people voted for parties that can be easily characterized as populist parties. And this happened in an economy that is booming. Hence, one needs to make the observation that populism can emerge when there is no perceptible economic crisis. And this is a very, very important observation, I think, for me to make. Why did it happen? There are no obvious answers, and it may be too early to draw conclusions. What I can tell you is that issues of identity matter, and they matter a lot in today's political landscape. It's not just about the economy. And there is a growing fear in all Western democracies, including the more prosperous ones, like Germany, that there are winners and losers from the fundamental changes that are taking place, which are brought about by globalization and technological change. And the losers are very much concerned. They feel they don't have a place, they feel they don't have a role. They vote in a particularly emotional manner, and they tend to vote against what they perceive to be the establishment, but without necessarily proposing a credible alternative. This, to a certain extent, happened in all European countries. It also happened in the United States. So looking forward and into the future, I think the main challenges for, I think, all Western democracies, including Germany, will be to propose a solution for our societies that combines innovation and entrepreneurship with some level of social protection and comfort for those who are left behind. It's sometimes easier to do the first than the second. And I think the real challenge for all establishment parties, but also parties that come from the center left, will be to place emphasis on the flip side of freedom, which is solidarity. And how do we develop real social policies for those who are threatened, who are left behind, and who feel they don't have a place in a world that is rapidly changing. This is obviously particularly relevant for Greece, but it is also relevant for countries that are much more prosperous, such as Germany. So I'll stop here.
Obviously, the issue of economic inequality between specific regions of Germany and other parts, also in other countries in the West, it's a major political issue that the Western societies need to address, and we appreciate that, President. I would like to ask Dr. Daniel Gros, what are the challenges and obstacles for forming the Jamaica coalition? And in case we have a Jamaica coalition, would this coalition bring growth and investment in Germany by creating investments, by reducing the very high surplus and creating demand in Europe?
Thank you very much, Stelios. I was going to say it's a pleasure to be back here, because we had already an event with your Harvard Alumni Club several years ago. But in a sense, it's less of a pleasure when I think way back when we had hoped that by this time now Greece should have been out of the woods and should have a nice export-led recovery. which would make also all its fiscal problems much more manageable. So in that sense, I'm not so happy to be back. But let me try to answer your question in the following way. First of all, the so-called Jamaica will actually be de facto this time a four-partite coalition, because the Bavarian part of the CDU, which is called CSU, had a very strong defeat in its home region, homeland, and they have decided that they need to become more clearly defined, to have a better profile, and therefore the negotiations will not be just between Merkel, the Greens, and the Yellows, as the Liberals are called, but also with her Bavarian sister party, and that will complicate things. The real obstacle, however, is quite simple, the base of the Green Party. It's very likely that the Green Party leadership in the end agrees to a coalition treaty, as it's actually called. But in the end, they have to ask their bases. And the Green base is not very reliable. They could come back in the end and say, no, thanks, we don't want to. We prefer our party to remain in opposition. And then, of course, the ball will be back in the court of the CDU and the SPD, and in the end, we might actually see a revival of the Grand Coalition. Okay, but let's assume Jamaica comes about. What would be the economic policy of Jamaica as compared to the previous government? I would say little change. I don't think there will be much more investment. Anyway, as perhaps most of you know, the large majority of investment, of public investment in Germany, is done at the regional and Länder level, and the federal government has only limited influence there. The only issue I could see is tax cuts, which are a favorite theme of the Liberals. And this is the one way perhaps the government will actually, in the end, support demand in Germany by reducing taxes, for which it has some freedom of maneuver given the present surplus. And that, to some extent, might sustain demand in Germany and throughout Europe. But I would not hold my breath for major fiscal impulse from this new German government.
I would like now to ask Dr. Lorenzo Bini Smaghi, but before I go to Dr. Smaghi, I want to make an anecdotal point. The father of Euro, Bob Mandel, was the first speaker of this club approximately 12 years ago. During his speech, he mentioned, my two best students ever, the two sharpest economists I ever had, was Daniel Gros and Lorenzo Bini Smaghi. And it's wonderful to have them here because, as you will find out, they have very divergent opinions, so that will make the debate even much more interesting. In addition, Lorenzo Bini Smaghi succeeded another speaker and great fan of our club, Tommaso Padoa-Chioppa, which we worked with together during the Greek crisis. And after Dr. Smaghi, his position was taken by Draghi in the ECB. So there is a whole tradition. Dr. Smaghi, what are the lessons that we can draw from the German elections? Is it possible for Germany to turn inwards? And how do you see the election results changing the domestic political dynamics?
Well, first, let me thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure. After my ECB experience, I also spent some time in Harvard at the Kennedy School, not at the business school. I don't know if there is a rivalry here, but
no rivalry.
No, it was a great experience. You asked me very difficult questions. I lived 7 years in Germany, but I'm no expert. But I want to bring a little. I live 3 days a week in Paris, and I want to bring a little testimony of how Sometimes Germans have a sense of humor that is unexpected. I was at a dinner with a former German ambassador who asked, and what have you done in Germany? And he answered, well, we tried to copy you French, but we didn't really succeed. And it's true, if you look at the numbers, they are big in millions, but it's out of 80 millions of Germans. And if you sum the 12% of the AfD plus 10% of the Green, more or less, it's 20%, or 22, 23. If you go around Europe, the extreme, if you want to call them populist, are much bigger, if I think about Italy in particular, but France and others. So it's true that Germany is trying to be populist, but it doesn't really succeed. And in the end, it's kind of, I find it an alternance, how do you call it? I mean, going from center-right to center-left. I think some injection of liberalism after years of social democrats running economic policy in Germany, going more towards, rather than more expanding and higher taxes, maybe lower taxes, I think it's not necessarily bad. I'm not a diplomat, so I can speak freely, but I think it's not necessarily bad for Germany, and it's not bad for Europe. If tax cuts lead to greater spending, having a more dynamic Germany, and higher, I think, important thing is longer retirement age. Germans complain a lot about Greece having low retirement age, but the retirement age in Germany is low and has been coming down, while it should go up. And I think it's one of the main reasons why Germans save so much, is that the retirement age, I think, is not aligned with the expectancy of life. But having said that, I tend to be a bit more optimistic. I think in the end, as the economy, and I think a big part in the end of the result will depend also on Greece. It will depend also on Italy. It will depend on each country. But if, I think Merkel always said that we have lived a crisis of confidence, and it's very difficult to build institutions when there is no confidence, and it's difficult to get out of the crisis when there is no confidence. I think and we all need to work to rebuild this confidence. I think if each of us does its part, I think there are very strong expectations to do what is needed. By the way, Merkel governed with the liberals between 2009 and 2014 or 13. That's when the banking union was created. That's when the ESM was created. That's when the EFSF. So these were not perfect institutions, and we need to work better to reinforce them. But it's not true that the liberals are anti-Europeans or anti-other countries. I think it's part of the popular presentation, and a bit maybe to gain some votes. But I am a bit more confident in the end that if you bring the guys in Brussels, in the end they find out that you have to work together. It's easier to be critical of government staying at home than being involved. So even the choice of having a finance minister from the liberals, I think would in the end involve them more in solving the problem that we still have in Europe.
The next question goes to Ambassador Plötner. Ambassador, do you believe that the position of Merkel has been weakened in order to be able to offer compromises and closing deals on the European reform?
Do you want me to lose my job this evening? Or? Of course the Chancellor is not weakened. No, I'm just... The first part was a joke, the second not. No, I think that, traditionally Germany is used to coalition governments. And Mr. Mitsotakis is right to underline that this three-party, or even four if you separate CDU and CSU, this four-party coalition is a novum. We have never had that. So it's going to be very complicated to negotiate. And already these days, if you follow German politics, you see that parties don't even really know in which format to meet. The tradition is that the strongest party, so CDU, should invite. The CSU has said, we have had such a sounding defeat in Bavaria, we need to think and we need to reconsider our positions. Why have we lost so much? For them, this is extremely important because next year there will be regional elections in Bavaria, and they will subscribe to no agreement which jeopardizes their chances in what for them is the essential election, which is the Bavarian election. So this is a further complicating factor. So the CSU says we first want to talk to the CDU, we want to have a joint position, CDU-CSU, before we start talking to the two junior partners. The junior partners have said, well, in the meantime, maybe we could meet. Then CSU said, no, you shouldn't. We should first, and then we should meet all together. FDP says, we want to first meet alone without the Greens. So this shows you how complicated, from a purely logistical point of view, and of course there are politics behind logistics here, from a purely organizational point of view, this is going to be. Coming back to your question, the traditional role of the strongest party, which is the CDU, obviously, is to, to round the edges and to see to it that the end product is one which is balanced. In Germany, we have this expression of Volksparteien, People's Party, which means that you have a party which covers a significant amount of the political spectrum. It's not a party for a certain clientele, it's not a party for only left, only right, only center. It's a party which reaches beyond this political geography. And this CDU claims to be a Volkspartei, which in practical terms means that this is a party where you have a very vocal part of the party which is fighting for gay rights. And at the same time, you have a very conservative wing of the party which is more on the law and order side of matters. Not wanting to put these two into contradiction, but it just shows you where the priorities are. And the CDU pretends to cover all of this. So that is why for the CDU it will be quite normal to try and cover what the liberals think is important, as well as what the Greens consider important. So fiscal discipline, the liberals will say, CDU will say, that's exactly what we want. Ecological transformation of the energy sector, say the Greens, the CDU will say, we've always been in favor of that. We are only talking about nuances and how to get an intelligent and pragmatic balance between these positions. So it will come quite natural to the DNA of the CDU to balance out these positions without having to sell its own soul, because its soul, if I may say so, and to stay in this figure of speech, its soul is so broad that it can accommodate a lot of these individual positions. So I don't think actually she is weakened. If I would be writing for a newspaper, I would be more audacious and I would say maybe she's even strengthened because the parties are so disparate and she has the power of arbitration. But that might be going a bit far, but I wouldn't say that per se the result weakens her.
I see Dr. Gros making some point that he would like to tell us something different.
I don't want to comment on the interior German situation, but one thing is very different. During the crisis period, Merkel went to the European Council, and when she agreed, we have to create a European Monetary Fund, we have to have a European Banking Union, she came back to the Bundestag and said, look guys, there's no alternative. I have agreed to that in Europe. We have an acute crisis. Trust me, this is the only way to go. And that's why basically everything was approved, what she did. Now we no longer have a crisis. She cannot come back and say, I had no alternative but to accept things. And therefore I think it will be much more difficult for her to lead on a gradual reform of the euro area mechanisms than before.
Thank you. Now we're going to go to the next segment, which has to do with the European reforms, the Franco-German cooperation. And I would like to start with President Mitsotakis. Macron made several important proposals to reform the euro area and the eurozone. Can we form a new grand bargain for the eurozone to push all the necessary reforms while the countries are enjoying an unexpected economic recovery and the momentum has shifted from just survival to growing economy? And if that's the case, how long is this window of opportunity, President?
Well, there is clearly a significant window of opportunity for taking the European project forward. I think after the initial Brexit shock, it became very clear amongst all 27 remaining EU member states that we needed to push forward with an ambitious agenda of reform, not just for the eurozone, but also for the European project as a whole. And there's no doubt that President Macron has so far offered the boldest proposal, and in his most recent speech, he probably surprised a lot of us by talking more about the big European project and less about the specific Eurozone reforms. And some of the topics that he actually laid out are of particular importance for our common European identity, but also particularly important for Greece. I'm talking about common defense cooperation, very relevant for Greece. Greece is one of the few countries that exceeds the 2% threshold for military spending as a percentage of GDP. Issues of counterterrorism, and of course issues pertaining to common asylum procedures, migration, common border management. These are issues which are of great importance to Greece, and there is no reason whatsoever why Greece should not play a very, very active role in pushing forward this agenda. Personally, I also found Macron's comments about education, research, European innovation very interesting and very refreshing. We should not forget that a whole generation of young people had their first European experiences through Erasmus programs, and this Erasmus spirit is something which I think we need to rediscover in order to better understand our differences, but also our common values. Now, we're probably going to talk later about the specific Eurozone proposals. There, I think the approach is clearly more gradual, taken by the French president, compared to what was laid out initially. And of course, at the end of the day, there is at the core of this some sort of grand bargain that if France reforms domestically, Germany would be willing to entertain, in my mind, absolutely necessary steps to further the integration of the Eurozone in order to make it a more efficient currency union. We'll return to the topic of domestic credibility and domestic reforms when we talk about Greece, but I want to be optimistic. I think this is a significant opportunity, and I think both European leaders are going to step up to the plate, and I do expect. I think Macron is clearly very ambitious, but I also expect the Chancellor, having won 4 elections, to seize the momentum, and once the government is actually formed, to meaningfully engage on next steps. Some of them will be taken before 2019 and should be taken, especially steps regarding the banking union that needs to be completed. Some obviously will be pushed after the 2019 Euro election milestone. But we're not only going to talk about the Eurozone, we're going to talk about the whole European project.
My next question goes to Dr. Smaghi. Following many years of crisis, the governments acknowledged that Eurozone's incomplete foundations will require strengthening if the bloc is to survive another downturn. What is, in your opinion, missing in the Eurozone governance to avoid another crisis? What we should build short term, over the medium long term, and what is really feasible after all these elections, politically in light of the recent elections, what really can get done?
Now, I mean, coming back a bit to what Daniel was saying before, there is a paradox in the sense that Europe often moves when there is a crisis, because politicians go back to their electorate, say, we have a crisis, we have to solve it, you know, there is no alternative, Tina, that's a strategy. When there is no crisis, it's much more difficult to move forward because politicians tend to be short-sighted and they are not, you know, they are not provoked by a crisis. So what will they be able to do? I think the incentive could be, you know, if we don't do it now, we may have to do it later, and then the crisis is never the right moment because, as I mentioned earlier, there is an issue of trust. Furthermore, all the academics who think that we should move, you know, ideally like in the United States, I mean, this is theory. You move by steps, step by step. So what are the next steps? And what should be the next steps? I think what we should aim at is a system by which shocks, when they occur, are better distributed. So a better functioning financial markets first, better functioning banking system, but also when the public sector has to step in to stabilize the economy, that it is not penalized, because in a monetary union we don't have the exchange rates. Monetary policy is aimed at the euro area. So the real flexibility immediately is fiscal policy. And the room for maneuver for fiscal policy may be very limited, because if you have to absorb the shock and external shocks, and immediately you get into higher debt, higher interest rates, then you become, you have to then to tighten fiscal policy during the crisis. I think we have to find mechanisms, again, that try to help countries to address an asymmetric shock without having to get into an excessive restrictive fiscal policy. This can be done, of course, by behaving well in good times. So building surpluses or building good public finances in good times is very important, so that you get room for maneuver. But you don't have always the privilege of doing that. And if you think about, let's say, a country like Spain, who went through a major crisis because of a recession, then basically it was very close to bankruptcy in 2011, with a debt to GDP ratio which was close to 60%. Why is that? Because the markets started thinking, well, you know, if you cannot use the whole room for maneuver, if you go to higher debts, maybe they will not be able to reimburse, and the spreads went up to 500 basis points, higher than Burkina Faso, or, I mean, I don't know if there is anybody from Burkina Faso here, or from any other country, but Europe was more risky than any of the worst countries. And of course, what did Spain have to do? To restrict fiscal policy during a recession. This is not an appropriate management of economic policy. So we have to avoid the excesses, but we have to avoid becoming the place where people at some point see risk and run away from it. So I think if there is a common understanding, at least of these matters, and if we want to move step by step, there are ways, as I mentioned, to move forward. And hopefully we will be able to do that before the next European elections in 2019.
Dr. Smaghi, now that I have you available, are we really experiencing a revival of the Franco-German alliance? All these years, France was so weak financially, so we had the veto of Germany and the power of Germany. Can France deliver finally on the economic front and become a kind of an actual partner in a Franco-German alliance?
No, frankly, I think maybe I'm a bit an optimist, but Macron has really made a change in France. I mean, if you talk to French people, the last president really missed an opportunity, very disappointing. The previous one was too proactive and was not able to deliver. This is the first French president who is talking with a vision about Europe to French population which is not used to talk about Europe with a vision. Now, the vision, you can criticize it, but it's a bit vague. But, you know, at this stage, I think it's unavoidable. But clearly, he wants to have a common defense policy, a common policy with respect to immigration, with respect to security, to strengthen the industrial ability of Europe to compete. From that point of view, I think he's very similar to Merkel. He has understood, I think, that France alone is too small to compete. We need Europe to compete with China, with India, with the US. It's very courageous. I mean, we take it for granted outside France, but to have a European discourse in France is courageous. And I think he really believes that. And he's moving people. I mean, people see it fresh, and it's kind of enthusiasm. Will he deliver? Will he get more precise? I think on some issues, yes. I think you can see the Siemens, Alstom. He has a view of industrial, I mean, France, which needs to be strengthened. He has made a labor reform which is very strong. He has negotiated with the unions for 3 months. He has delivered. We will see. The fall is going to be very complicated. There are going to be strikes. But I think in the end, he has no alternative in this case because France has been needing reform for a long time. So I think he's regaining credibility to sit at the table with the Germans and say, you know, I've done my job, I've reformed, maybe more than you did, and now we have to think together about strengthening Europe. So I tend to be relatively optimistic. The problem is that Europe is not only France and Germany. We tend to forget that. Europe is also Italy, is also Greece, is also Spain, and so on and so forth. And, you know, we need to make a move, I would say, also in Italy in particular, but also in Greece. I mean, if we would be able to move and to put a little bit our house in order, I think the atmosphere would be much stronger, and the willingness of the others to compromise would be improved.
All the experts think and believe that the 800-pound gorilla in all this reform, and which will affect dramatically also our country, it's the European Banking Union. And the question is it realistic and possible to move with a pan-European banking deposit insurance? What are the obstacles? How can overcome them? Dr. Gros, please put your thoughts on this.
Thanks. This is, in fact, one of the key issues, the leftovers from the reforms of 2012-13. And as we said earlier, there's no longer a crisis to push for reforms. And I think that is one of the key problems. Now, I think the deal which is on the table, so to speak, is actually quite clear. On the German side, it has been stated quite clearly that they cannot agree to a banking union with full deposit insurance if on the other side there are countries where the banks hold a lot of domestic government debt, and if that government has a problem, then in the end the German contributors will have to pay for that via the banks. The solution is simple in theory, difficult in practice. Simple in theory in the sense that what many people have said is that the fact that these banks hold so much of their own government debt is really a source of instability. It's very technical, but it's this what's called the diabolic loop. When a bank holds a lot of government debt and the government has difficulties, then the banks become weaker. They can lend less to the economy. The economy becomes weaker. The government gets less revenues, and it goes on. So the simple solution on the surface would be to tell banks, when you hold government debt, please do not hold only the debt of your own government, but hold a diversified basket of other governments. So the German banks would hold Italian, French, Spanish, maybe even Greek debt, and the Greek banks would hold German, French, Italian, and a little bit of Greek debt as well, but it would be diversified. Many economists have said, that's easy, that's the solution. Practically, it's very difficult because, of course, many banks depend on the revenues they get from the government debt. But this is, if you want, the deal which is on the table and which I think is the only way to get the banking union moving. It's just I don't see a lot of appetite, neither in France nor in Germany, for going there. Because the Germans say what's there in it a lot for us, on the French side also. And therefore, if one is realistic, one should not pin one's hope on say, the enlightenment of politicians to now move suddenly strongly on the banking union. But there's perhaps one ray of hope, and that comes back what was said earlier, namely that actually there's a confluence of interests between countries like Greece or Italy to have a more European solution on asylum, on border controls. And there's also an interest in Germany on that side, partially because of the AfD, partially because the CDU also and the CSU, they want to show that they are securing the borders of Europe. And therefore, my hope is that the countries which have the biggest contrast on the economy side, Greece and Italy versus Germany, have also the biggest common interest on securing the external border. And maybe there's a big package one could do, that one makes a profound reform of the asylum system, of how European borders are defended by a European agency, and at the same time, one agrees on a banking union. And that's the kind of package deal which I hope should be possible.
Before I go to the next topic, sorry for the false alarm, everything is perfect here. There are a lot of empty seats, and we have tons of people around sitting, standing. Please come and fill the seats. It's important. I want you to feel comfortable here. For the last 10 to 15 years, Dr. Gros worked on the European Stability Mechanism, the so-called ESM, and the transformation into the European Monetary Fund. We have the expert on the topic. And my question is, Dr. Gros, are we really moving towards a European Monetary Fund? And what is the German position? What is the European stance? Can you enlighten us for the prospects on the European Monetary Fund?
I would say to 90% we already have a European Monetary Fund. We have the ESM, which is ready to help countries in difficulties. It has substantial firepower. It has built up now a staff which actually should be able to design and monitor programs. So these functions of a monetary fund of the IMF we have now already in Europe. Now the only difference is that, of course, the IMF has a somewhat different decision-making mechanism. You can decide within the IMF about programs without having everybody agreeing. And that is not possible in the ESM. But there's a difference. Every individual country has a very small stake in the IMF. And IMF lending is practically riskless because it's a small part of the country's external debt. It's super senior. So most countries say, okay, I'm outvoted in the IMF, but that represents a very small risk. And anyway, it's 0.0% of my GDP and of my public expenditure. The ESM is different. The ESM is 20 times larger relative to the economies of the countries. The ESM can engage up to 4 to 5% of the GDP of a country in loans which ultimately are risky. That is about 10% of public expenditure. Now the key question comes is, are there many countries which are willing to say, I'm willing to be put in a minority when an institution can potentially engage money which is worth 10% of my annual expenditure? Do I still keep my fiscal sovereignty? And perhaps the ambassador here, I don't know whether he wants to, but he could certainly enlighten us about the limits which are in the German constitution against doing that. And not only in the German constitution. Think about the case of Finland or Slovakia for those who have followed these things more closely. I cannot see really very many countries saying, yes, we agree, we could be put in minority to have then the ESM deciding about how our taxpayers' money is put at risk. In principle, I would be all for it. Would be better to have an ESM which has a better, quicker decision-making mechanism, but I'm afraid it would be very difficult to implement right now, given the limitations, political and constitutional, which many countries have.
I would like to ask Dr. Smaghi about the European budget. The formation of a European budget has been one of the important elements of Macron's vision. The European Commission accepts it only as a line item inside the EU budget. And while Macron is saying, I want a big budget, I want to really go where is distressed countries and I try to go and help, the German position is, let's have a small budget. So realistically, Dr. Smaghi, where do we stand with the formation of a European budget?
Well, I think this is, I always say that, negotiating with Germans is relatively easy if you are within a given framework, in the sense that, if you look at German negotiation for wages, the unions ask for 6%, the employees offer 4%, and they go on for months, and then at the end they settle for 5%. So Macron is asking for a big budget, knowing that he will not get it. If he started with a small budget, he would get even less. So I think it's a negotiating starting point, knowing that Merkel said that she is willing to consider a budget for something. So I think the first step will be to consider a budget, maybe to create incentives for reforms, to create a budget to maybe help countries that have problems in absorbing unemployment, as long as it is temporary. So I think it's, I think, again, Macron has started with a grand vision, grand objectives, where we should move. Clearly, if we had a bigger budget, the shock-absorbing function that I was mentioning before would be much easier, and would make it easier maybe also to adopt some of the reforms that the German government is proposing, like, in terms of private sector involvement when you have a crisis and so on and so forth. But I think he knows he will not get it right away, that it is a start, and it's important to make the German government move on certain issues, such as having a budget and deciding together what are the priorities to manage the budget. Let me maybe just mention one thing to what Daniel said. I mean, let's remember, these are not expenditures. These are loans, which have a rate of interest. And this may be a transition to the last point of the discussion, when you want to come to a hot topic, which is debt restructuring. And this may be a way to explain why it is so difficult for Germany to accept, not so much to accept reprofiling, reduction of interest rate, but a haircut. I think that would be difficult, because then it would weaken my point that this is a loan and it's not something that taxpayers in the end will really pay. I think taxpayers are not really interested in the end. I mean, you can explain taxpayers that the interest rate will be paid in 30 years, the loan will be repaid, but if it's not repaid, then it's become a transfer. And that's why the Germans are so rigid in having a haircut, while probably they would accept a lengthening of maturities and so on and so forth, because then this goes back to the Constitutional Court and all the things that make it difficult to say, I want to decide everything. I want to put a veto power because this is taxpayers' money, and I cannot accept that a coalition of Italians and French will decide on my taxpayers. While if it is a loan, and if it is reimbursed, you know, in the end, if there is sufficient conditionality, it's more reasonable to have a qualified majority in the ESM. At least that's my interpretation.
Stelios, can I translate Lorenzo's word?
I'm always interested for your translation.
Basically means, if there's debt relief, there won't be a European Monetary Fund.
To have a European Monetary Fund deciding qualified majority, if people think that, in the way you think, that a loan is an expenditure, that is money which is gone. So the money that we lend to countries is gone. Now, the proof until now has been, we have proven this theory wrong, because the Irish, the Portuguese, the Spanish have reimbursed. So all the Germans which were arguing this money is gone to these southerners that never give back the money, you were wrong. But there is one country which is left, which is Greece. And so
we will cover Greece in the next segment.
We will come to this point later, but this is to explain maybe the context in which, you know, there are unintended consequences of discussions.
Before we go to Greece, two more questions. The concept of the Eurozone finance minister, it was in a way promoted as someone who will have operational autonomy and has the oversight by the European Parliament. The German side has been to have it as a combination of a Eurogroup president and European Union Economic Commissioner, more like a change of title. Daniel, where do we stand on the concept of the Eurozone finance minister, and what do you see realistically happening?
Maybe you should have asked Lorenzo again on this one, but I think we stand between two stools. The German vision of somebody who can intervene and tell countries not to spend, and the French vision, somebody who can intervene, tell countries to spend more. And the natural compromise is to have somebody here who cannot say anything. And unfortunately, that is the most likely outcome.
I can imagine when we go to the Greek segment what you're going to say. I wanted to ask a political question to close this subject to President Mitsotakis. How do you analyze and perceive the situation in Catalonia? Do you see it as a threat for Europe?
That came out of... It's a very worrisome development. In principle, one cannot tolerate any concept of border change within the European Union, certainly not without the agreement of the sovereign state, the member state. Having said that, the scenes that we saw yesterday are in themselves quite worrisome. I'm not that knowledgeable about domestic Spanish politics, but right now it seems that we have forces have been released in Spain that will not be easily contained in the near future. It is not very easy for the European Union to come out with sort of a position that is not very rounded. But at the end of the day, what one cannot accept in principle is a cascade of separatist movements that go against the wish of sovereign states. This is potentially going to be lethal for Europe, and it's certainly one of those sort of black swan events that maybe a few people predicted some time ago, but it has certainly gathered a lot of very worrisome momentum.
We usually say we keep the best for last. We're going to Greece. My first question goes to Ambassador Plötner. Do you believe that the new government coalition might weaken Merkel's ability to make compromises on any future programs for Greece? Difficult question.
Didn't expect less. I think it's useful to approach this question from a maybe somewhat surprising angle. The liberals in Germany, the FDP, they have been out of parliament now for 4 years. They suffered a crushing defeat 4 years ago from a very, very good result, and 4 years of governing with the CDU, they fell into they fell very, very deep. They were out of parliament for 4 years, and they regenerated themselves, number one, in the opposition, and number two, in the Länder parliaments, where they in the last 4 years had quite some success of joining regional parliaments and also becoming part of regional governments. This led to a renewal of a significant part of the party program and a significant part also of the party leadership. So obviously now they have a very good result from being out of the parliament to coming in that strength is a remarkable political achievement. But it goes together with a program where I think the general feeling is not everybody in Germany knows exactly what the FDP wants on each and every subject. They stand for digitalization, they stand for entrepreneurship, they stand for fiscal discipline, individual liberties. These are their trademarks. But the technical issues which have been keeping us busy in government the last 4 years, they were not party to, and they didn't need to position themselves in government votes in the parliament, in the Bundestag. So this leaves us with a somewhat fluid impression of where they stand, for example, precisely on the issues, the technical issues of European reforms in the financial sector, and also where they stand on the day-to-day management of, for example, the Greek issue in the responsible European fora. We have a few very short sentences said in the heat of the election campaign. There was talk of Grexit from some as something which one should have another look at, but I consider this to be very, very preliminary statements done in the heat of election campaigns. And honestly speaking, I think the policy of the FDP, the fleshed out policy of the FDP in this area still needs to be defined. And my gut feeling, but this is only a gut feeling, is that this will not be their main claim with which they go into coalition negotiations. They have not been elected on a ticket saying we need to be extra tough on Greece. They have been elected on a ticket saying we need to have fiscal discipline, but how do you define that? I think there is a lot of room to accommodate the specificities of the Greek case, and so I think that on this point, I don't believe that on this point there will be a conflict, a major conflict in the coalition negotiations.
Now you understand why a few days ago the German Foreign Minister Steinmeier told 2 European commissioners, I send my best diplomat in Athens. I would like to go to President Mitsotakis. Given the challenges, the upcoming reforms and questions arising from the German elections, what should Greece do to exit the crisis and become again a credible partner with the other European nations?
How long do you want me to talk?
Maximum 5 minutes.
Look, obviously, there is a lot of talk about the implications of the German election on Greek domestic affairs. Personally, I don't expect any significant change. The reason being that at the end of the day, our destiny is in our own hands. My major argument has always been that Greece needs to assume full ownership of the necessary reforms and convince what I consider to exist a silent majority of Greeks that it is worthwhile pursuing these reforms, not just because they're part of the program, but because they're necessary in order for us to become a competitive economy and in order for us to, at some point, reach the point where we have a functioning and efficient and meritocratic public administration. The problem with Greece today is that the current government does not believe in most of these reforms. They're pursued grudgingly, they're pursued without any real commitment. Hence, Greece is not able to attract the level of investment it requires, and it is portraying the image of a country that is not really friendly towards outside investment, which is absolutely critical in order for us to break out of this vicious cycle of low growth. Yes, Greece has been relatively efficient in delivering a tight fiscal policy and delivering results as were requested by our creditors, but it has done so by pursuing a policy mix which by nature is rather recessionary, focusing very much on increasing taxes and social security contributions and placing no emphasis whatsoever on rationalizing public spending and making the public administration more efficient. So some of the targets have been met, sometimes they have even been exceeded. The end result, however, has been that the Greek taxpayer and the Greek middle class has paid a very, very heavy price for this adjustment. So I want to be absolutely clear that no further delays in terms of the completion of the third review can or should be tolerated. It is a necessary but not a sufficient condition in order for us to break out of this vicious cycle. And of course, if one were to look beyond 2018, the future of Greece past the end of the third program, if one would hope for what everybody would hope for, what they call a clean exit, I would add a big asterisk to this concept of a clean exit, and that is the following: that the Greek government, the current Greek government, has currently restricted any future government with fiscal measures that exceed 5 billion euros for 2019-2020. So this is not exactly a clean exit in my mind, because we're still under a very restrictive fiscal policy. But even if that clean exit in theory were to be achieved, Greece would need to regain significant credibility, increase its creditworthiness. We need to see a significant reduction in spreads in order for us to borrow money as any other normal country post-program does. And this currently seems a tall order because, again, there is, in my mind, little credibility when this government talks about real reforms. So the challenge has always been the same, true ownership of the reforms, a committed and efficient government in implementing these reforms. I think that a new government that would be able to deliver on this reform agenda would be able to generate significant interest from foreign investors and would, in due course, buy us the necessary credibility to talk about what I consider, and I will stop here, to be one of the fundamental problems for the medium to long term, and that is that we're still faced with very, very significant restrictions when it comes to our fiscal policy, when we have committed ourselves as a country to a primary surplus of 3.5% for the next 5 years. So talking about a tight fiscal policy at a time when you're trying to get out of a crisis, you risk doing all the structural reforms, but still having a fiscal policy that is not really helping us to break out of this low growth vicious cycle. What I propose is very clear, and it is a reform deal with our creditors that we exchange a reduction in the future primary surpluses post-2018 in exchange for specific reforms which we will undertake to implement, which will be particularly related to the efficiency of the public administration. We would have to do these reforms anyhow in order to become more competitive, and they are necessary in order for us to restore credibility which has been lost in spite of some of the kind words that we hear about the current government. I think that most people don't forget, certainly Greeks don't forget, what happened in 2015, how this tragic experiment cost us more than 100 billion euros, and they don't forget that we are reaching, the end of 2017, and we're not yet where we were at the end of 2014. So we have, at best, lost 3 years, and there has been significant pain for the average Greek citizen.
We are going now to go to very practical issues and address a few elements: the debt relief, the surplus, the recapitalization, the NPLs, the migration. My first question will go to Dr. Gros. What will be the impact of the German coalition on the Greek program, the debt relief, a potential precautionary arrangement with or without the IMF to ensure the fulfillment of the country's debt service obligations? Do you see a change from the current policy? Do you see something happening?
I don't think there will be a large change from the current policy. As my neighbor already said, the FDP doesn't really have strong opinions either way. It has anyway become now basically a one-man party. And what this person thinks, we don't know yet. But let me say something about the clean exit. Actually, what I think would be best would be a clean exit by the creditors. And I mean the following. Greece no longer, the public sector no longer has a deficit. Therefore, any debt issuance is only to refinance existing debt. It's not new debt, it's not new borrowing. It's just old debt comes due. And so I think what the ESM should do is basically tell Greece, you do not go to the market for the next 20 years. We refinance everything which comes due at our 1% or 0.5%. And you, Greece, promise us you will not go on the market and get money for whatever, 5, 6, 8%, because all that money is down the drain for the creditors, and the European taxpayers basically, or the Greek taxpayers rather, have to pay for that. And then I would say, okay, so you basically will run no deficit for the next 20 years. You do your reforms whatever way you like. Bye-bye. See you again when you are hopefully a different country. Because anyway, we have not been able to impose the reforms which we wanted to. And we think it's much better that Greece decides on its own, in its full sovereignty, what it wants to do. And for the time being, the debt is being refinanced. The little private debt, which is still outstanding, is being refinanced very generously. At any rate, Greece right now pays less in interest on its public debt, much less than either Italy or Portugal and other European countries. So the interest burden is not a question. And therefore, I would say this would be a way where then Greece can decide on its own. Does it want to spend more? Does it think it can spend the more efficiently to increase its growth and its capacity later? Or not? And I think after these years and years of haggling and threats and programs, half implemented, a little bit more implemented, I would say it would be much better to have a clean exit. We put the debt on ice at a very generous low interest rate. In the meantime, the Greeks can decide by themselves what they want to do.
Dr. Smaghi, I would like
It's
you...
the same question.
It's the same question, obviously. I want you to translate, Dr. Gros, now.
No, first I wanted to comment on the strategy, which I think it's a good strategy, the one you presented. It's a bit of a paradox of our democracies that it's easier to raise taxes than to make reforms. And this is not true only in Greece, it's true also in Italy and in other parts of Europe. And I think the experience, for instance, with the Italian previous government, that if you're willing to make reforms, you can get some flexibility in the fiscal trajectory, I think is there if you are consistent in making your reforms. I think Italy started well, got the flexibility, and then the reform process got a bit lost in the translation again. So I think the strategy is right. The point is to deliver the reforms, which is always very difficult. You need to do that at the beginning of the new parliament. Having said that, I think that, as Daniel said, if you look at the interest payments on GDP of Greece, is about 3-point-something%. Italy is 4 and something, and Portugal is even more. So I think it's the burden can be reduced. I think it could be reduced even. Personally, I am against the haircuts for the reasons I mentioned before. I think it's not strategically, it's not appropriate, and it will not work. It will raise a whole issue of constitutional problems in Germany. It will put in danger the reform process, because it will prove all those who were against helping Greece and helping others that it was a transfer, and they knew it from the start, and so on and so forth. While, why is that? Because basically public account does not use mark-to-market. So a loan at 0 is the same as a loan at 2% or 3%. So I think and in the end it will not really help to have a haircut by 20-30%. It will bring down the debt to GDP ratio from 170 to 150, and that's not the problem. That's not the end of the issue. I think if you have the kind of deal that I mentioned, that you do the kind of 2 or 3 structural reforms which are important, which are a game changer in terms of growth, and you have a lengthening of the debt, I think, in my view, that's the best way out for the next 4 or 5 years. Then, down the road, we will see. But if you take the net present value of the Greek debt, I think today it's lower than Italy's, probably. Don't tell this to the German taxpayers, because they have less. But if at the end of the day you're able to show that the debt is still current, has not been cut, that some payments were made, so German taxpayer did not lose money, and in the end there is some, pressure to reform. I think even for Greece it is the best outcome. It's not easy to explain this to the IMF, though. I don't know why. It's not easy to explain to the IMF. I don't know if it's the Chinese people or the Indian shareholders, but maybe this is a good reason to have a European monetary fund without the IMF, finally.
My next question goes to Dr. Gros. Is it possible to achieve, it has to do with the surplus, is it possible to achieve a further relaxation of Greece's primary surplus targets? And if yes, can the current debt relief framework accommodate such an adjustment?
I think what Lorenzo and I was trying to tell you is that you're barking up the wrong tree. Sorry. In the sense that trying to reduce the primary surplus should not be the long-term goal. I always make the comparison between Belgium and Italy. They both entered EMU with a very high debt ratio. Actually, the one of Belgium was higher than that of Italy. Belgium, they had a program to reduce the debt level gradually through primary surplus of actually 4% of GDP. And Italy initially had the same plan. Then comes a light recession, at least by today's standard, 2001. And Italy says, we need to give the economy more demand. And they stopped with the primary surplus. And then, of course, when the crisis came, the Belgians had no debt problem whatsoever because they had continued. And the Italians mastered a massive attack on their public debt. Their economy had massive problems. Their banks had massive problems because they thought it was more important a few years earlier to stimulate the economy. So for Greece, I think it's not so much a question of the primary surplus. I think 90% of the problem is how to get the Greek economy going. Because then what the Greek government has achieved is really, I would say, heroic. Because to have this kind of primary surplus with such a depressed economy is extremely difficult. So I think instead of talking about the primary surplus, 90% should be how to get the Greek economy going. And you know that I have my own ideas about that.
A comment on this.
Absolutely.
It's heroic, but also probably wrong in terms of policy, because we ended up delivering a bigger surplus than was requested, which had a significant impact on depressing our growth rates. So the real question is, can you grow an economy with this level of taxation, with a middle class that is literally destroyed by a double combination of very high taxes and very high social security contributions, only to reach a nominal target of primary surplus, and that at a time after having lost 25% of our GDP. Because we're not in a normal state. When Belgium and Italy started this process, they were in a normal state. This is an economy that currently has investment at 10% of GDP, and we need to get up to 20% of GDP. Obviously, taxes are important. Yes, you can change the fiscal policy mix, and you can make the government that more efficient, but government spending has also been significantly reduced. So the real question is, we all want to get the economy going, but are the sort of typical structural reforms of deregulation, product and market liberalization, labor reform, which, having said that, has already taken place in Greece, are they sufficient, to really allow us to get our head out of the water? Because if you talk to every sort of average Greek business person or a self-employed person in this room, they will tell you that we have exceeded the point where almost work is meaningful. And this in a country that has a significant tradition and expertise in tax evasion, which means that the more you increase your tax rates, the less comparative benefit you will get. Look at the VAT gap that was published very, very recently. Where the truth is, this economy has been good at tax evading. They know the ropes and they know how to do it. So even this policy risks being counterproductive. So I don't at all discard the importance of the important package of structural reforms. These need to take place at any cost, and they're necessary. But the question is, are they sufficient, and are we sacrificing a lot in terms of growth potential by sticking to our primary surplus target in the short term, that is being imposed simply because our creditors believe that if they don't keep us on a very, very tight leash, we will start spending again, and we will start rebuilding the clientelistic state, because that is the truth. That in my mind is a real reason why we have such a high primary surplus, because there is no trust. And again, if you had any fiscal space, or if any fiscal space would be given to Greece, it should be very, very clear that the fiscal space should be used to reduce taxes and social security contributions, and not to increase spending.
Dr. Smaghi, you've spent a lot of time in the inns of the European Central Bank, and now being the chairman of Société Générale, so we need your enlightening comments. For the NPLs, the non-performing loans are the major issue for both the Italian and the Greek banks. What do you see at this stage as the most appropriate actions that the European Central Bank should implement to address this issue?
Well, I mean, give advice what the banks should do. Let me take an example, a successful example, the one of UniCredit. They changed the CEO. The CEO came in and said, I want to get rid of the NPLs. I take a loss of 10 billion or more, and I go out to the markets and I try to raise money. People thought he was crazy, and he did it instead. He sold the NPLs, he got a huge loss, and he recovered the capital, and the new shareholders gained 30% of the last 9 months. What was the key to all this? The key is that you have to have an equity story for the investors. You have to explain to the investors that they will be the last one to get in. So they have the upside. If instead the investors think that they are going to be the last but one, they will not get in. Why do you have to get rid of the NPLs? I think that my experience suggests that it's a different job to manage NPLs than to do the normal banking activity. When you're a banker, you go out and try to find good customers, to lend them, to assess the risk. When you manage NPLs, you have to go out to your clients and tell them, okay, you owe me 100, give me 30, and we close. And if they don't, you start to suing them. And you start doing a kind of activity which is not proper to a bank. Because basically you lose your clients. And you're not trained to do that. And if your NPLs to total credit is 50%, you need to allocate so many people to this new job. When you lose resources, you need to, it's a different job, basically. So unless you're really very good at it, you have very good people, you have the stamina also to go out to these people and threaten them, your clients, basically, which is not the job of a banker, I think it's better to sell them. The key issue, and I don't know if there are bankers in this room and CEOs, is who is going to start this. Typically, it's a new CEO. He's somebody who says the fault is the previous guys. I'm sorry, I just came. We clean the balance sheet, we do everything. Let's do really even too much of it, and we start the upside. Now, of course, the NPL is one thing, which is cleaning the balance sheet. The second is being profitable. So you need to be profitable. As a bank today is difficult with low interest rates, high costs, competition. So you need really to do some restructuring in your bank. But my point to close is that really this is the key challenge for any country, but especially Greece. We are talking a lot about fiscal tightening. But in my view, the problems in Greece, as much as the problems in Italy, has been a combination of fiscal tightening and credit crunch. Because if you're an economy where you raise taxes and your bank doesn't give you money, you're not going to go very far. You're going to a loop which is perverse. So I think it is as important to restructure the banking system as to do the kind of things that you mentioned earlier. And if you postpone things, they're just going to get worse and worse, because if you don't get rid of the NPLs, your cost of capital goes up. You are not going to be able to lend money to. You may be surviving as a CEO and as a bank, but not for very long in the end. So I'm not sure this is, maybe that's where I get maybe the bad news for banks. But unless you do it, your successor will do it sooner or later.
Well put. Now my question comes to the recapitalization of the banks. Dr. Smaghi again. Do you share the IMF's concerns for capital adequacy of the Greek banks? Given that the December 2015 recapitalization tests were based on adverse scenarios but that were never materialized, what should the banks do?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, I mean, capital is needed when you need to absorb losses, and you have to present a business plan which is credible for your shareholders. Even if your NPLs were zero, but you were not profitable today, which is, the case of German banks, for instance. German banks don't have NPLs, but they have a problem of profitability. And today it's very difficult to find new shareholders, new people willing to put money into a bank if it doesn't earn money, because if you're a saver, you have alternatives. So in the end, the appropriate capitalization of the bank depends on the amount of NPLs, but also the kind of business model you have in mind. So I don't want to say, in general, banks are undercapitalized, because like in Italy or in Germany, other countries, there are some banks which are well capitalized and others who need more capital. But in the end, it depends on the kind of equity story and business model that these banks have in mind to present to customers. So if you're a bank with a lot of NPLs and a business model which is not very profitable, I would say you need more capital today, of course.
Dr. Smaghi, no, now I'll go to Dr. Gros. Would you say that the new coalition government would insist on retaining the IMF or replace it with the European Monetary Fund when it comes into the Greek situation? And an idea that was thrown a few times around, can the European Stability Mechanism or the European Monetary Fund replace the IMF and obtain the portion of the Greek debt?
Yeah, that comes back to what I said earlier. All the expensive debt which Greece has, which is private debt, and also the IMF debt, can and should be substituted by ESM lending, which is almost free. Actually, Germany allowed that to happen in the case of Portugal, which repaid its IMF early, and the Germans said, okay, and ESM stays in the game. I think the new finance minister, if he or she is FDP, I think will see the interest of Germany. They will be less wedded to the old mantra of Schäuble that the IMF has to be in there. So I could very well see the ESM funding substitute expensive IMF funding, but otherwise very little will change. It saves Greece a couple of 100 million interest payments per year, but the basic setup will probably not change. The IMF might pro forma remain on board without any funding, but just, or perhaps with minimal funding, just so that they can say, yes, the IMF is still on board, but no substantial IMF money is involved anymore.
Dr. Gros, do you believe that Greece can participate in the quantitative easing program?
I think that will remain very difficult for some time. And also, I don't see what difference it makes. There's very little private debt around which actually could be bought by QE. But what does QE mean? It means that the Bank of Greece would buy up private debt owed to the Greek government. So basically this is left pocket, right pocket, because the Bank of Greece is part of the general government in Greece. So instead of the government owing money to private investors, then it owes money to the Greek central bank, and the Greek central bank owes money to the banks which have a deposit with it. It doesn't reduce the debt. It does the only thing it does is, instead of having high interest rates on long-term debt, the central bank only pays a very low interest rate on the very short-term debt it has. But I would warn against the illusion that somehow, if Greece participates in the QE, that it would be a reduction in the debt or anything other material. It's basically just a refinancing, and doesn't change the substance, neither the amount nor anything else.
But politically it will be important. I mean, it will be a signal, you know, I mean, if it happened, which the conditions have to be satisfied, that, you know, you're a little bit less, a bit more out of the woods. I mean, you know, the woods are getting, you can see the light at the end of the tunnel, which is not sufficient. But I think it would be my fear is that the conditions will be met when the ECB ends QE, which is at the end of probably at the end of next year. So, you know, the timing may not be right. Maybe symbolic, but I think it's an important. You know, I think Greece needs some recognition that things are going in the right. I mean, they are going in the right direction, but even, you know, more quickly.
But then I come back, sorry, to what you said earlier. Debt relief and participating in QE. Can you imagine happen that at the same time?
It's fascinating to see the two brightest European economists expressing the northern and the southern views. We appreciate that. My next question goes to Ambassador Plötner. We are concerned about the impact of the coalition on migration policies. Here in Greece, we have an amazing organization called Solidarity Now. I see several of the directors in the audience, which have over 300 people, and we have helped over 100,000 people, migrants and poor Greeks. I preside this organization, and we are all very concerned. What will happen if Germany changes the agreement with Turkey, given the FDP situation, and what will happen with the new migration policy of Germany? Ambassador?
Well, first of all, allow me to share with you my experience of meeting a host of representatives of Greek NGOs who are active in the field of aid to refugees, and I must tell you, I'm really sincerely very impressed and touched by the civil engagement and by the tremendous work done by a lot of organizations here who themselves are not in an easy situation and who are doing a marvelous job, and I think that deserves all our respect and admiration. Coming to your question, I'm a little bit puzzled because I don't see why my country, whatever government is in office, should have an interest in changing the EU-Turkey agreement. On the contrary, I think despite our significant differences we have with the Turkish government at the moment, We think that the EU-Turkey agreement is something we absolutely need to uphold. It is in Europe's interest, but it is also, we believe, in the well-understood interest of Turkey itself. So whatever government materializes in Berlin, I cannot imagine a constellation where this agreement is called into question. Going to your second question of how German migration policy will evolve, I think it will evolve, but I don't think in any way which should be of concern to Greece. I think we will strongly work for a European migration policy, European border policy. This is something which many parties are keen on doing, of making Europe big on the big issues and maybe not so big on the question whether olive oil on the table needs to be in sealed bottles or in open bottles. I think this is something, there is a general impression that Europe should refrain from too much interference in such matters and concentrate on the big ones, knowing that also on the small matters it's not Brussels to blame, but very, very often, mostly it's the member states to blame. So it's not a cheap criticism of EU institutions, but it's a criticism of the way we as member states used Europe. So big on big issues, and that's why I expect support from Berlin on making Europe stronger on these issues. I think one important topic in the coalition negotiations will be if we manage to have a modern migration policy. The Canadian model is something, for example, the Liberals are looking at. I could very well imagine that CDU and CSU find this to be attractive too. But this in no way, I think, puts into question what Greece and Germany with other partners have done together in the last years, and which I find to be a textbook example of European solidarity. Although I know how difficult the situation on the Dodecanese Islands is, but still you have virtually every European country present there with police officers, with migration officers. This is something which in this scale and for such a long period has never happened before in the history of the European Union. And it stands to show that indeed crisis moments are traditionally strong moments for Europe. What we need to do afterwards is take the impetus of a crisis and build something which is sustainable and structured.
Ambassador, thank you. President Mitsotakis, a few days ago, the president of the Eurogroup, Dijsselbloem, made some comments about the ideal timing of the elections and more. Do you have any comments on this?
Well, let me start by saying that creditors always use polite words for Greek governments. Seems to be rather customary and not very surprising. Having said that, I would like to make two observations regarding the question that you asked. It's the Greek constitution that determines very clearly when Greece will or should have a national election. It would happen in case the government loses its majority, or if the Prime Minister decides to call an early election. And it's not up to anyone to determine when the right time would be or should be for Greece to have an election. This is a purely domestic affair and a domestic matter. My second observation is the following. A potential election, early election in Greece, in my mind, is not a source of political instability. Obviously, I'm biased, but it's the only way for Greece to acquire a pro-reform government that is truly committed to implementing the necessary changes that Greece requires in order to grow again and in order to achieve a level of economic growth that is acceptable for the average Greek citizen. So in that sense, if an early election were to take place, and I'm very clear that my party would very much favor such a development, I see no reason why it should be perceived as a source of potential instability. If anything, we have shown, my party, real commitment to reforms, something which cannot be said of the current government.
Now, given that the club works like a Swiss clock, we would like to open up for 2 or 3 questions from the audience. Platon Monokrousos, Chief Economist of Eurobank. Do you have a...
I would like to congratulate the speakers for their insightful views. My question relates to the policies implemented during the crisis. At the peak of the crisis, there has been intense criticism, especially from the other side of the Atlantic, regarding the fiscal austerity programs implemented in a number of euro area countries. Now, these countries, including Greece, have managed to remove these imbalances, and it seems that the biggest imbalance, macroeconomic imbalance, in the euro area at this point is the twin surplus of the German economy. So my question is whether there is hope that the election outcome in Germany and the new coalition government, and probably this remobilization of the Franco-German axis, may move us towards a better, let's say, policy mix, a better policy orientation away from austerity. Thank you.
Daniel, would you want to pick up on this question?
I think I said at the beginning, I don't expect any big policy change in Germany. As in every country, politics is made looking at national interests, and the perception in Germany is that the politics of, or the application of austerity in Germany itself has been very beneficial for the country in the long run. And therefore, I expect no big change. Maybe the Free Democrats will insist on a bit more tax cuts than the economy can actually take. So there might be a small reduction in the surplus, but I don't think this will have any material impact on the external current account surplus. Instead of 8%, it might go to 7%, but that's about the order of magnitude you can expect.
I would just like to add that having a trade surplus is not a national policy goal. It's a result of a number of factors, and speaking under the control of 2 prominent economists here, my understanding as a simple lawyer is that there is not the magic button you can push and taking the policy decision to reduce your surplus. Would it be there? I think the thought could be entertained of pushing it to a certain extent, but it is not there. And earlier on in the evening, my neighbor pointed out that the spending structure in Germany is such that a lot is being spent by the Länder, and that there the influence of federal government is limited, and so I think that the way policy makers in Berlin look at this question, they do not have the impression that this is a policy option which they can negotiate about, but that this is the effect of a host of factors on which most of them they have no influence.
Yes, just to say that economists don't always agree, but the way to justify also things sometimes. I mean, what does policy has effect on? I mean, clearly Germans save too much, and this is a deflationary impact on the European and world economy. So we cannot say that the government cannot do anything to change this. First, they could cut taxes, and it could allocate taxes differently. I think that there is a budget position to do that. And second, I think the liberals will cut taxes more than the social democrats. Second, you have to increase the age of retirement so that people stop having anxiety about saving. If they work more, probably they have a better confidence in when they will be. But we have to stop this anxiety that leads everybody to save so much, because this is creating deflation and low interest rates all over the world, which are in the end penalizing the same savers. So you save a lot, you have low interest rates, and at the end you have to save even more to compensate for the. We are I think in Europe, but also at the global level, because we are all saving. I mean, Italy is saving, now even Greece is saving. We are all saving for, and making the life of financial institutions even worse, because we don't know what to do with all these savings. And there is not enough investment in our society. So we need to create, and from this point of view, being a bit more in favor of a liberal market economy, more flexibility, more investment friendly, hopefully more investment will take place also in Germany. So maybe I'm optimistic, but I think that if we don't get out of this saving glut in Europe and in the world, we're going to be much worse off in general.
The ambassador asked me to comment on the German side of my left.
Just one last, from my point of view, comment on this. I don't perceive, 10 years ago there was this German Angst all around, and Germans were people scared of the future. And if you look at the latest sociological data we have, this feeling is gone. There is a large majority of people who say, I'm well off and I look happily into the future. And so I don't think that it's this, being scared of the future which makes them save money. There may be a lot of other factors. And for the first time in the last 3-4 years, we have seen domestic consumption being a strong pillar of our economic upswing, which was missing for a long, long time. So I think there has been progress on this field, which which I think cannot be increased in a significant manner by lowering taxes, because once again, I'm only a lawyer, but my understanding is if you give more money to spend to a German consumer, you cannot order him to buy foreign products. He might still buy Siemens, Miele, Mercedes or Volkswagen, and then, to my, once again, limited understanding as a lawyer, that does not have the effect we are all looking for to reduce our trade surplus. So I agree with the thrust of what you're saying. Simply, having been in Berlin and having sat in discussions politicians had with economists, I have met no economist who could tell a German politician, if you do that, you are guaranteed to have that effect.
Great. Professor Veremis?
Well, I was wondering whether you would ever come to the elephant in the EU room, the elephant from across the Atlantic, who's always been there, but he has a new persona now, not a very friendly one. Will this cause disarray to the European Union members, or will it make them stick together?
Who would like to answer this question, gentlemen? No. We found a very voluntary ambassador.
This reminds me of the Asterix and Obelix, when the chief says, "Who volunteers? Step up," and all step back but one, and then he is the volunteer. So, no, I will obviously not comment on the American president, but I think the way the world is moving, and also the way the American president has spelled out the priorities of his presidency, stands to show one thing, that we Europeans need to get our act together. And I mean, this is the way Mrs. Merkel put it, that maybe, you know, given the way things are, we have to rely more than in the past on ourselves. And that is, I think, a feeling many of us Europeans share. It becomes complicated when it means, when we go down to what does that mean in practice. And that's what we've been talking about this evening, is how do we stand up and get our act together? That means spending more money for Europe and in Europe, and this means giving up sovereignty in order to have a strong Europe, stand up in the world for our interests and for our way of living. So I think, as easy as it is to say we need to be stronger as Europeans, I always want to add, in order to be honest, that this means taking difficult choices and making very difficult compromises. And I just hope that everybody who agrees to the first sentence will not have forgotten his conviction when it comes to the late night session where you have to make the painful compromises.
If I can add something, you know, before, with your previous administration, there was a competition to be friend of the Americans. Now there is a competition to be, I wouldn't say not enemy, but more to be the one who is representing European values. I think Merkel understood this first, but Macron is running very fast to catch up, and others in Europe are doing the same. So I think there is a beneficial effect, if I can say, and the fact that Macron is talking about defense policy, I think, and industrial policy, I think makes, shows that France is understanding what Germany, I think, understood much earlier, that our competitors, I mean, you can compete only if you are European, not if you're national. So I think I'm optimistic from this point of view.
The last question goes to Miranda Xafa.
My question goes to both Daniel and Lorenzo, and it's very specific. Where do you think the European Capital Markets Union project stands after Brexit? Do you think that it's an opportunity for the remaining 27 members to relaunch the project, perhaps with a more ambitious agenda? Or do you think that now that the European economy is recovering and banks are restarting to lend, it's going to be a very hard sell, because it's not necessary to look for alternative sources of financing? Thank you.
Lorenzo will have the last word. My own evaluation is that Capital Markets Union is not going anywhere. With Brexit, we lose the only champion of capital markets financing as opposed to bank market financing. And on the continent, the banks are usually very close to the government. They're extremely strong in lobbying. So I'm afraid that the combination of European banks getting stronger and their lobbying power, I think very little will change. But let me add to the gloom by saying that actually I was always skeptical that the Capital Market Union could achieve a lot. We can eliminate all obstacles to cross-border capital markets, bond markets, equity markets. But if ultimately the German saver wants to have a bank account, biggest intermediation will be via banks. And it's not only in Germany, it's in most countries that people just in Europe prefer to hold a safe bank account and maybe buy some bonds at most. And therefore, very little will change unless we radically change the way we finance our retirement schemes via bigger pension funds. But I'm convinced that Lorenzo will say much more about this.
Gives me the opportunity to disagree with you, and also to say how misconceived the German position is on this. to consider capital market union as something bad, because it has the word capital in it, with a K, and that the banks are against it. It is exactly the opposite. Banks are in favor of capital market union because they can make much more money if there was a capital market union. Why is that? Because we would do like the American banks. You take all your mortgages, you package them, and you resell them in the market. So you make money twice. First, when you lend money to your mortgage, for instance, and then when you make a fee to sell it. That's where the American banks are making money. The fact that we in Europe don't have a capital market, we have to keep everything on our balance sheet. And we can make money only once. So in fact, the big banks, at least, are in favor of a capital market union. That's the way to construct a capital market union. You need banks who trade among themselves, who make the liquidity. Maybe the smaller banks see the capital market as a problem, but I don't see in the US small banks being penalized by a capital market. I think, unfortunately, Brexit is weakening Europe. And if you see, in particular, I mean, London, as a major financial center, is made also of the American banks and European banks. Many American banks are bringing people back to New York. So one of the gainers is not only the competition between Paris, Frankfurt, and Amsterdam, but New York. And this is very unfortunate because it's cheaper to hire somebody in New York to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning than to hire him in Frankfurt or Paris. That's the paradox of labor markets also. Maybe one day it will be cheaper to hire him in Athens, but today the competition is even better. You don't get him to wake up at 3 o'clock maybe in the morning, given the regulation of the labor markets probably. But this is the risk. We are going to lose competition with New York and maybe with Asia. So Brexit is a problem, and we need to find a way to recreate within Europe and develop and put pressure on Brussels and on the countries to harmonize all the things that need to be. It's a long project, but this will be beneficial for the European economy and for the banks, I have to say, at least for the large banks. And I think Germany and France and the other countries have to give up, because some of this sovereignty, like a single supervisor for the markets, unless we do that, we will not have a capital market union. We need to have the courage to move forward, because this is for the benefit, I think, of all our companies and those who create jobs in the end.
On behalf of the Board of Directors of the Harvard Business School Club, I would like to thank the speakers for their insightful views and constructive contribution. I would also like to thank you all for participating and raising challenging questions in tonight's event. The reforms that we discussed tonight are of vital importance for the future of our common European project. These reforms are urgent and necessary, and they will put to test the European leaders' political realism, as they will be required to forge compromises in order to solidify Europe. The next German government coalition may bring beneficial changes to the European economy, especially if its proposals for reforms are well tuned with the ambitious proposals of President Macron. Greece's economic recovery and growth, while dependent to a certain extent on the European reforms, is mostly determined by our ability to attract investments by putting the private sector at the driving seat and streamlining the city intervention to ensure an open and competitive economy. We hope that leaving this event tonight, we are all a little bit wiser and a bit more confident that better days are coming for Europe and for Greece. Thank you all.